I usually ask myself, why should I go in the evening to the ERF conference? I don't have a paper. And usually when I get the invitation, I say, La, I will apologize. But then I know now why I'm coming here, because you feel young. And you feel still young, still willing to work, to study, to read. And I know that Ragi is the one behind all that. So this is why. Our subject today in this, the topic today in this session is very important. Is around what we all discuss now, unpaid care work in Egypt. And as we know, women in Egypt, they perform the vast majority of unpaid work. So we are discussing here the case of women mainly. And it takes a lot of their time, in particular married women. Women participation in unpaid work is almost universal everywhere, but it's like 88% of working age women involved in such work. As we said, married women are mainly the category which is involved in the majority of unpaid work. And employed married women perform the highest number of hours per week of total work, whether paid or unpaid. And as I always say, the surveys show something around 15 hours per day for employed women inside and outside, but for employed men, it's around 9, on average, 9 hours per day. So there is a lot, there is a difference here, and it's a gender issue. And if you cannot, if you cannot say that we should abolish this kind of work, then we can discuss something like decent unpaid work for women at least. I don't want to be long because we have 3 papers, and the first paper is on unpaid work in Egypt, gender gaps in time use, exactly what we are talking about. And it is by Marianne Atalla and Marina Hisham, and will be discussed by Marwa Amaluddin, UN Women. Actually, Marina Hisham is an assistant lecturer at the Faculty of Economics, Cairo University, and she holds a BA in Economics from the faculty and MA in Economics from University of Paris 1. And she is currently doing her PhD in both Cairo University and University of Paris 1. Her research interests include gender economics, microeconomics, and microeconometrics. Marianne Atalla is an assistant professor also at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science. This is also why I'd like to come to ERF, because here I feel I meet always my colleague here, my young colleague. And she received her master's degree in development economics from the University of Paris 1, Pension Sorbonne, and her PhD from the Paris School of Economics and the University of Paris 1. Her research interests lie at the intersection of labor and development economics. You have 20 minutes sharp, so that you can, after that, hear Dr. Amir Alamuddin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hiba. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you here today. Briefly, we'll start today the presentation tackling the working paper on the unpaid care work in Egypt as a part of the gender gaps in time use. In fact, the importance of this study stems from the fact that, as Dr. Hiba was just mentioning, that when we are talking about the gender disparities in the time use, it can be considered as one of the key features of the gender inequality in Egypt, as in any other developing countries. Because actually, when women are devoting most of their time to do the unpaid care work within their households and for their families, they will lack time in order to be able to participate in the economic and social life. So it can be considered as a great impediment for them. And when we are talking about these gender disparities in the time allocation, it's crucial to take into account the effect of the traditional gender norms because they will dictate what is expected of each individual based on his or her sex. So women will be expected to be responsible for most of this work, to clean, to cook, to take care of the children. And on the other hand, the man will be expected to have a paid job in order to be able to secure the financial resources for his family. And along the presentation, you will be seeing that the marital status can be considered as a key predictor of how much time women will spend on these activities of the unpaid care work. So briefly, we will be focusing on these takeaways of our presentation. So first of all, and for the first time, we'll be using the new time use module that is integrated in the ELMPS, the newest wave of 2023. And the advantage of this module that it will be giving us the opportunity to delve more into better insights on the extent of these gender disparities between men and women. Also, a key message that in terms of the extensive margin, 84% of the Egyptian women aged between 15 and 64 years old, which is the age of the working population, and which will be the scope of our analysis in this paper, participate on a daily basis in the unpaid care work activities compared to only 34% for men. So we have a gender gap of 3-1. Also, when we take into account the intensive margin, so when we calculate the average hours per day spent on the unpaid care work, we find that women of the same age cohort do around 5.5 hours per day compared to only 1 hour for men. So in terms of the intensive margin, the gap is 5-1. And this gap, in fact, it increases for the married individuals to reach a gap of 6-1. So all in all, we can say that married women, specifically when they are employed, they face a double burden, as they will have to balance between their familial life and the unpaid care work and the related job commitments. And finally, by the end of the presentation, you will also see that the very rigid gender norms and the social expectations will have, or they will prevent the meaningful change in the gender roles and in turn, the time use patterns in Egypt. So the outline quickly of the presentation and the working paper will start first by having a quick overview of the time use by the socio-demographic characteristics, and then by the household and family dynamics, followed by the labor market status and gender norms. And finally, we will have some concluding remarks and the policy recommendations. So to start, when we tackle the time use in Egypt by the different socio-demographic characteristics, we focus on 4 main characteristics: age, marital status, educational level, and location or area of residence between urban and rural areas. And in fact, despite that each factor has an impact on the time use pattern, however, the age and the marital status can be considered as the most critical factors in shaping the time use patterns in Egypt between men and women. From this graph, on figure 1 on the left, you can see the average hours per day spent on employment and productive activities in direct unpaid care work and the direct unpaid care work for the different age cohorts. And the first thing you can see that the gender divide in the time spent on the unpaid care work starts early. So it starts from being aged between 15 and 19 years old. We can see that women spend on average 2 hours per day on the unpaid care work compared to only less than half an hour for men. And you can see that this gender divide progresses across the different age cohorts and then reaches its peak of 7-1, so 7 hours for women compared to only 1 hour for men for the age cohort between 40 and 49 years old. And on the other hand, you will see that for the employment-related activities, it's like a mirror. We have the exact opposite. So men will devote more of their time to the employment-related activities. And we can see that the gender divide is nearly constant over the different age cohorts at 0.2-1. So in other terms, it means that for each hour spent by men on employment-related activities, women spend only 12 minutes compared to them. On the other figure on the right, on figure 2, you can see the average hours per day, the time spent according to the different marital status. So first of all, for the never married women, we can see that also there is a gender gap. However, this gender gap is increased, and it's at its maximum for the married individuals to reach around a gender divide of 6-1. So for every hour spent by men on unpaid care work, women spent around 6 hours per day. And we can see that this gap would be reduced for the divorced and the widowers. And for the employment-related activities, we can see that there is also a gap that would be reduced specifically for the divorced individuals. Now we move to the time use patterns when we consider the household and the family dynamics, and this actually complements the previous analysis. So first of all, when we see from the graph for the never married, we can see that here we focus specifically on the women time use. So they start at a 2.5 hours per day, and then when they get married but without children, this increases to above 5 hours per day, and then it reaches its peak when now the women will have children who are aged below 6 years old. So for those women specifically, they will be spending more than 8 hours per day on the unpaid care work, and then it will be reduced as far as the children will grow older, specifically when we are talking about the direct care work, which implies that the direct care work is more responsive to the care needs within the family. However, the indirect care work, we can consider it to be more rigid. And on the other hand, we can see as women reduce their time spent on the direct care work, they will be able to increase their time spent on employment, even though the increase is not really pronounced. Also, if you consider now by the household wealth quintile, we can see that now from Q1, which is the least wealth quintile, to Q5, that the time spent by men on the indirect and direct care work, it doesn't really differentiate between the different household wealth quintiles. So it's an average of about 1 hour per day. However, on the other hand, when we tackle the time use by women, we can see that there is a decrease in the time spent specifically on the indirect care work between the first quintile and the fifth quintile. And this specifically can be interpreted by the fact that for richer households, women can use market-based solutions or some devices that may help them to reduce their time spent on the indirect care work. And in this case, they will have more time, for example, to the employment-related activities or the leisure time. And now we'll continue the other parts with my colleague, Mariam.
Thank
you.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks, everyone. Pleasure to be here. We now move to time use patterns by labor market outcomes. So here we look at never married versus ever married individuals, comparing those who were employed, unemployed, or inactive. And we see that across all the different labor market statuses, women still spend substantially more time on unpaid care work compared to men. And this, the low amount of time spent by men on unpaid care work doesn't seem to be interpreted by the fact that they're working more in paid employment, because as we see here, even unemployed or inactive men never spend more than 1 hour per day on unpaid care work. And the female groups with the largest or the longest time spent on unpaid care work were unemployed women and inactive women, who spent around 7 hours per day on unpaid care work, compared with around 5 hours per day for employed women. And the female group that spent the shortest time on unpaid care work were employed women who were never married, at around 2 hours per day. Now we look at time use patterns by employment status and institutional sector. So when we aggregate time spent in both paid and unpaid work, we find that women who were employed in the public wage sector spent the highest number of hours of total work, so both paid and unpaid, at around 10.5 hours per day. This was followed by women in the informal private sector, who spent around 10 hours per day of total work, and then women employed in the formal private wage sector at 9.5 hours of total work per day. And when we compare those who were never married and the ever married, we can see that while women tend to adjust both their employment hours and their unpaid care work hours in response to marriage. This does not seem to be the case for men. Now we take a look at the link between time use on the one hand and gender norms on the other hand. So the literature shows that time use patterns and time spent on unpaid care work is usually strongly associated with societal gender norms. These norms are usually rooted in culture and shape expectations on what is accepted from individuals based on their sex. So to assess this potential correlation between gender norms and time use, we're going to use a series of questions in the ELMPS to assess attitudes or beliefs regarding a set of gender norms. We specifically focus on 4 key areas: gender equality, which we measure by the individual's agreement with equal treatment for boys and girls; traditional gender roles, which we measure through 2 questions: agreement with the husband's involvement in raising children, which is a reflection of direct care work, and the husband's agreement with agreement with the husband's involvement in household chores, which reflects indirect care work. We also look at agreement with female labor force participation and the acceptability of using childcare services. So here we see for men and women who agree or disagree with the 2 statements on gender roles. So whether the husband should help in raising children and whether the husband should help in household chores. We see that when men agree that they should help or be involved in raising children, they spend half an hour less on employment, but this does not lead to any change in the time spent on unpaid care work. For women, however, when they believe that husbands should be involved in raising children, they spend slightly more time on employment and slightly less time on unpaid care work. For the question on whether husbands should be involved in indirect care work or household chores, we see a slight increase in men's time spent on indirect and direct care work for those who agree that they should be involved in household chores. But for women, we don't really see that women who agree that husbands should help in household chores, the difference is very marginal and it doesn't really translate into less time spent on unpaid care work. So to conclude, we find that the female to male ratio of participation in unpaid care work was 3:1, and this widens to 5:1 for direct caregiving tasks. We find that socio-demographic factors like age, marital status, education, family structure, area of residence, all of these influence the gender division of unpaid labor, especially age and marital status. In terms of household and family dynamics, we find that women with young children, especially children under 6 or those in lower income households, tend to spend more time on unpaid care work, while wealthier families seem to be able to afford to relieve some of this burden, either through outsourcing some of this to the market or through time-saving appliances. We find that employed married women were the most time constrained as they worked more than 10 hours daily across paid and unpaid tasks, which shows the need for policies that address these gendered care expectations. We also find that differences in gender norms did not necessarily translate into meaningful differences in the actual time spent on unpaid care work by gender. So some of the policy recommendations that we propose is, first of all, since the gap in unpaid care work starts at an early age, so during adolescence, starting from age 15, integrating more egalitarian concepts into school curricula and also extracurricular activities could help influence younger generations perceptions of gender norms and gender roles within the household. And for individuals who are already in their prime age or in the work, in the labor force, family-friendly policies and flexible work arrangements could be promising. So this could include remote work, paternity leaves, on-site childcare services, which could help in balancing caregiving responsibilities and redistributing unpaid care work. And another important point is that we need enhanced market services, expanding access to affordable childcare and elder care through government subsidies could increase women's labor force participation. But of course, any of these policy options would need to be evaluated through rigorous impact evaluations to determine which would be effective in the Egyptian context. As a recent paper by, I think, Korea and co-authors showed that childcare subsidies did not increase female labor force participation in Egypt. So we need a deeper analysis of the mechanisms, how gender norms work, and how they influence behavior, so that we can arrive at a more egalitarian redistribution of unpaid care work. Thank you.
Thank you. In time, really, in time and clear. And but concerning one sentence, when you spoke about the wealthier families, women from wealthier families, they can reduce the time spent on unpaid labor work, unpaid work, care work, in comparison to females from other socio-economic status. When we discussed this before, or when we studied this before, we found that women from wealthier families, they have, yes, the time spent on unpaid work is less than the other women. But the time spent on children, unpaid work, I mean, this is unpaid work also on their children, is more in ours than the other women. Because the other women, they have also now the washing machine and the cooking and. But the wealthier women, they can afford to get somebody to help in domestic work. And the time spent on their children is not even more, it's more than women who are not employed. They spend more time, it's like a guilt field, because they are working, they are spending more time on taking care of their children than even women who do not work. So this is one issue I wanted to raise. But we have Dr. Marwa Amaluddin. She is the Deputy Representative and Head of Programs at UN Women Egypt Country Office, and she has around 20 years of experience in sustainable development. Marwa has an extensive experience in working within the UN development system on foregoing strategic partnership, planning and coordination. And prior to joining the UN, she managed various programs in the areas of democracy, governance, and gender equality in the Middle East and North Africa region. And Dr. Marwa, I know her father, Dr. Alamuddin, was great, not journalist, he's a professor at the Faculty of Journalism. And her mother, Dr. also Layla, she is also, she was the dean of the Faculty of Journalism, Moscow. And till now, she is a figure at Cairo University and everywhere, actually.
Thank you, Dr. Heba, and I really appreciate the kind words about my parents. I'd like to thank so much the two researchers on an excellent paper, and for me and for UN Women, time use surveys actually really show and indicate clearly how time is spent, and it was a clear indication of the gap in gender equality when it comes to how much time is being spent on care work by women versus men. some of perhaps the key findings, I mean, I'm not going to go into the methodology and so on since I'm not a researcher by trade, but some of the key findings and trends that were apparent to me, one is the double burden. It's clear that women have to do unpaid care work at a very early age, and then when it comes to, married women, especially if they're working, they're actually spending more time. And that is an indication of why then could be one of the many reasons, of course, that why female labor force participation is quite low in Egypt and the Arab world. But also it's an indication of also, even when looking at the socioeconomic profiles, it's still women, and as Dr. Hiba mentioned, women that are educated, that are employed, are still spending a lot of time when it comes to unpaid childcare. Part of it, as Dr. Hiba said, it could be out of guilt, but also because of the quality of services that exist and whether these services are up to the standards and are available or not. And then when you look even at the labor laws and how they are supportive or not supportive of equal child care, maternity leaves, paternity leaves, and different kind of family-friendly, as you call them, policies would make a difference, would allow women to, try and balance. But again, it doesn't really address the biggest issue, which is the social norms. Because even in the time use survey, I noticed that even when men and women were clearly saying that they actually endorse and are supportive of equal bearing of the care work, again, in the same household, it's not equal. It's clear that women bear the majority of the housework, of the care work, especially the direct care work, which again is important to share, not just to elevate the burden on the women, but also for the benefit of the children to have both parents involved more directly with them and help directly with that. It's not just for the men to support in the indirect household, but household care services, but also the direct ones. And then also, and that really requires a lot of work, the gender norms, and a lot has been happening. The data you've shared from the Imager survey in 2017, a lot has happened since then, but clearly it's still not enough to be able to really change the mindset and make sure that it is more, inducive of such policies. One thing that I'd also like to mention in that UN Women back in 2 years ago or 1 year ago, we actually did a study to see what would be the economic return of investing in the care economy. Specifically, we looked at the early childhood and elderly care, which women in the household would be responsible for. And we saw that if the government actually invest 1% of the GDP in those two sectors, that would have a huge economic return, more than even investing in the construction sector, because it will allow them to create almost 1 million jobs, around 929,000 jobs annually, with which 62% will be for women. So it's also benefiting both women and men, and those include direct jobs and indirect jobs that would help with that. What else is there? I mean, in terms of policy recommendation, I think you've made some policy recommendations in your paper related to, changing the curricula, making sure that, those kind of stereotypical roles are not, entrenched in children at an early age, but it also comes from the household. And you even mention it in how, daughters are more inclined to support, the women at the care work at an early age versus men, versus boys. So again, it comes back to the family and how you address that and how you actually make the change. And then there's also the policies when it comes to the labor law, now that a new labor law is almost out, so that's also an opportunity to make sure that that happens. And then again, the private sector specifically, where we are now looking for the employment, how does the private sector support and provide a more family-friendly working environment, both in terms of the working hours, the working conditions, but also providing care services that allow both men and women to have those services for their kids. Because it's not about just the women bringing their kids there, but it's also for the men, because that's all about how they kind of share the burden. And perhaps I'll stop here so I know that we have too many papers in this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, it was clear, and you added services and unpaid work in Egypt by Ragi Asad and Sarah Ragab. So I don't know, how did you summarize your bio in a paragraph? Because Ragi, yani, we should talk about.
I already heard about it this morning, so I don't think you need to introduce.
You know Ragi? Have you seen him before? Okay. But can I introduce Sarah?
Can I?
You will? You will? Okay. Okay. That's a good job.
Well, my co-author, Sarah Ragab, is also my PhD student in Minnesota. She just started. And prior to that, she was a research program officer at the Economic Research Forum. And prior to that, she was my master's student in the Masters of Development Practice in Minnesota. So, So this really complements the first paper very well. I'm sorry that I'm on the agenda 3 times today. I was hoping to present this tomorrow, but that's the way the agenda worked out. And some of this already was clear in the first paper. Our estimate is that it's almost 6 hours of unpaid care work for every hour that men do. And I think the estimates maybe vary by a small amount, but it's clearly a huge multiple. This paper is going to really focus on indirect care work. Because the role of appliances and services is really going to affect the sort of cooking, cleaning, shopping aspects of women much more than it's likely to affect their direct care work activities. So we're going to really focus on the indirect care work, which, by the way, is 80% of women's time in care work. And so the main question is, does access to home appliances and infrastructural services have a time-saving effect on the time married women spend, and focusing on married women, on indirect care work? And if so, which appliances and which services are the most important? Well, this turns out to be a fairly difficult question to answer. And I thought I would find a lot more literature about this and a lot more work. But the reason it's difficult is because based on their conditions, women make decisions about what appliances to purchase and also possibly what services to access, but at least more so. And so there is this problem of reverse causality or causality going in both directions, which makes the research agenda more difficult. So we, of course, have this categorization in the time use survey where we can categorize time as employment or subsistence work, which is production of goods for own household consumption, indirect unpaid care work, direct unpaid care work, and other time uses. The time use module is based on the 24-hour recall from the previous date of the survey. And so we're able to get at total hours in indirect care work. And we can, in this paper, I even break it down into time, food preparation time, cooking, cleaning and taking care of your households, and then other indirect care tasks such as shopping, travel, etc. Because there's even a gender pattern in the way these indirect hours are spent. Now, we also have a very good measure of which appliances households have access to. We divide them into basic appliances, refrigerator, stove, washing machine, water heater, and supplementary appliances that maybe fewer households actually have, probably more connected to the level of wealth of the household. And then infrastructural services, we have access to piped water, electricity, sewage networks, garbage collection. One has to keep in mind that access to piped water and electricity in Egypt has become quite universal. which means that there's no variation in the sample across people, and so we're less able to study the effect of these services compared to sewage networks and garbage collection, which tend to be less widely spread. So the biggest challenge is really this reverse causality or mutual causality aspects of the problem. I have to admit that we didn't find very good solutions to this challenge in the case of appliances. In the case of services, part of the problem can be solved by aggregating at the community level and showing to see what proportion of your community has access to these services, which has less to do with your own individual decision and more having to do with where you live. And so to the extent that people in Egypt don't have a lot of choice as far as where to live, so they don't follow, then you might be able to deal with the reverse causality to some extent. But it still remains a problem in this research agenda in problem. So I'm going to give you a summary of the results of what we found. And then maybe if I have time, we'll show you the details of the estimations, but probably more important to give you a summary of the results. So the only appliance, or not the only, the main appliance to seems to have the consistent effect under multiple estimation strategies is owning a stove. And it clearly has a time-saving effect on indirect care work. And of course, it's associated with reduced time cooking, but also less time in cleaning and other indirect care. And we dealt with the potential endogeneity by adding many controls to try to correct for the education of the woman, her wealth status of her household, the income of the household, the education of the husband, the access to various services in the community. So lots of different controls to try to correct for this what's called the unobserved factors that could be confounding the effect. And so I'm reporting primarily results that have survived after we add all of these controls to correct for differences among women. Owning a vacuum cleaner is also associated with time saving in indirect work, mostly as expected through its effect on time spent on cleaning, but also it seems to affect extent of time in other indirect costs like travel and shopping for some reason. And the standalone freezer is associated with time saving in cooking and cleaning, but overall it seems to have an insignificant effect on indirect care work. And the basic appliances as a group have a larger effect on time savings and indirect care work than the supplementary appliances. So if you add them both together in the model, you find that the index of basic appliances has a bigger effect. Now, the results on access to infrastructural services are a bit more mixed. Initially, we found that, again, consistently access to garbage collection services had a significant effect on indirect care work, time in indirect care work. And it's mostly due to its effects on time spent cleaning and in other indirect care tasks. But if we, this is when access to garbage collection is defined or specified at the community level. If we specify it at the household level, whether you as a household have access to garbage collection service, for some reason the effect disappears. But I think in general, it is appropriate to specify it at the community level rather than the household level. Now, access to sewage networks initially had a big effect on time savings in indirect care work. However, once we controlled for a variety of individual household and community characteristics, that effect disappeared. So we were left basically with the garbage collection results. As I said, the electricity and water are so widespread that it's hard for us to detect their effect. Now, just a sense of how widespread some of these services. So as you can see, piped water, 98% of households with slight differences between urban and rural areas. Electricity, 99.5% of households. A fridge, 98.7% of households. So to the extent that we don't have any variation across households and across women, it's very hard to detect effects. But as you can see, for some of the other services and some of the other appliances, we have much lower percentages. And of course, some differences between urban and rural areas, and we're able to better detect their effects. Now, I'm not going to go through some of the detailed results, but I wanted to show some graphs that look similar to the ones that Mariana and Marina presented, but here I'm breaking up indirect care work into cooking, cleaning, and other indirect care, just to show you that there is a very different gender pattern. So even the little amount of indirect care work that men do, married men, let's look, maybe focus on currently married men, they do about 0.9 hours of indirect care work. 0.8 hours are in these so-called other indirect care, travel, shopping. They don't do any cleaning and cooking, minimal, almost nothing. Whereas women, married women, spend 2.1 hours per day on each of the activities, cooking and cleaning, and then another hour on these other indirect care activities. So there is a huge gender differential in terms of within the category of indirect care work between men and women. Now, I'm going to skip those results. They're basically the results that I discussed earlier in the regression form, but I think it's inappropriate to go into the details. So let's just say that the time spent in indirect unpaid care work is systematically associated with access to some home appliances and infrastructural services. We know that ownership of basic appliances such as a stove is negatively associated with time spent in indirect care work, even after correcting for a host of individual household and community characteristics. Supplementary appliances as a group don't seem to have a major effect, but individual appliances such as a freezer or a vacuum cleaner seem to help. But among infrastructure services, we're only able to establish that access to garbage collection consistently reduces time in indirect care work. The challenge remains that we don't really have a very strong methodology to make sure that these results are not confounded by women's own decision-making related to other unobserved characteristics. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raghi. Again,
Not part of your fridge.
Okay, thank you. That's new for me. We have now Dr. Abdurrahman Negi is the lead of evaluation specialist. Yes, I'm sorry. It's Maya Sibandi because you corrected. So I thought it is now Maya Sibandi. I'm sorry, from Beirut. Maya Sibandi, assistant professor of public health practice at the American University of Beirut. And previously, she was social scientist with global health sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, and she held a number of other positions, such as evaluation officer with global health sciences at the University of California, and other position. She received her PhD in sociology and demography from the University also of California. Maya is online, yeah.
Hello. I have a PowerPoint if it's possible to show. Let me see if it... Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Very clear.
Great. Okay. So thank you for the very interesting paper. I'll try to keep my comments brief, but I did put together some slides mainly because I wanted to show this figure, which is a well-known framework. It's now been adapted to the 5 Rs, but a well-known framework for thinking about care work and particularly unpaid care work from a policy perspective. And the 3 Rs framework is looking at care work in terms of recognition, reduction, and redistribution. So the first point that I would like to make is that it's very nice to see a paper that's focusing on reducing care work. I think this is an understudied part, understudied in the literature, as Dr. Raki mentioned, in part because empirically it is quite challenging, but it's something where the ELMPS data really gives us an ability to try to look at it, which I think is important. But my overall comment for the paper, I think also considering the empirical challenges of the topic, is that another approach is to try to think about reduction of care work more in terms of its overlap with the distribution of care work or the redistribution of care work. So a couple of comments with regards to the approach of the paper, which I may or may not help in terms of being able to identify some of the effects, is that I had a couple of questions with regards to the definitions that are being used and thoughts on how these might be revised. So first of all, in terms of time-saving technologies or services, the distinction between basic versus supplemental appliances, I thought could be reconsidered or perhaps tested in a couple of different ways. I think it's a difficult thing to say what is a basic versus a supplemental appliance, in part because this is likely to vary across contexts. And I think actually what we see in Egypt is that some of the, or one of the appliances in particular, kitchen machines that were classified as supplemental, over 90% of households had them, whereas washing machines, which may be considered basic in other contexts, many fewer households had them. So one approach might be to rethink that categorization between basic and supplemental, and focus where we do have a considerable amount of variation in ownership. My other comment was with regards to how time is spent. And I like very much the idea of disaggregating the types of care work between cooking, cleaning, and other activities. But some of the associations between specific types of appliances and specific types of care work or indirect care work I found were not very intuitive. And so I'm wondering the degree to which we have sort of concerns about recall or potentially about women in particular performing multiple types of care work at the same time. And I know the authors accounted for the fact that people often, or women often perform indirect and direct care work at the same time, but I wonder to the extent to which women are performing multiple indirect care work activities in a chunk of time, and the reporting of this is perhaps not as clean as we would like it to be able to make those distinctions. So that's with regards to the definitions. With regards to the models, I did not have any incredibly creative solutions for the endogeneity problem. But I did have a couple of questions or thoughts, and then I'll present some of my overall thoughts in the next slide. But although there was a very wide range of controls included, and the reasoning for this was very clear, some of the specific controls, the reason for including them wasn't apparent to me, particularly around sort of age and education gaps between spouses. Women's employment wasn't included, I understand, because of endogeneity with household purchases, both in ability to make them and in the benefits or the degree to which women see them necessary. But I don't know if somehow stratifying the analysis, looking only among women who engage in wage employment, for example, we might be able to look a little bit at the degree to which, these sort of endogenous decisions about the degree to which households invest in time-saving appliances may be related to women's employment status. And then a minor comment, but I think it's more intuitive to present the outcome in terms of minutes saved, in terms of hours saved. And then I'll come to some of my bigger picture comments. And I think in terms of thinking also about the policy relevance of the paper, given that I was also not able to come up with a great solution for the endogeneity problem. But one of the things that we see very clearly from the models is that household composition is very much important for how much indirect care work women perform. And particularly that when there are other women in the household, women perform less indirect care work. So one approach might be to look at the total hours of indirect care work that are performed by women in the household and consider relationships between appliance ownership and this total number of hours. And also the degree to which the presence of these types of time-saving technologies or services might shift the distribution of who within the household is performing indirect care work. So is it shifting indirect care work between women in the household? Between women and men, we think is unlikely, probably, but potentially between women and children. If the prevalence of or the access to services or availability of time-saving appliances mean that women are performing these tasks rather than children who might have been sent out of the house to perform them, etc. Whether that in sort of from that angle, we can think also about with the time that is potentially saved by these presence of these appliances and services, where is that time going? And I think this has also policy implications. And then another question is, I think, the degree to which we may reduce multitasking. And from there, from that aspect, I think putting back in that aspect of the degree to which women are doing direct and indirect care work at the same time is important from a policy perspective in terms of thinking about time that women may be saving in indirect care work. Does this mean that they're doing direct care work by itself rather than combining that with these household tasks? Because this also has implications then for the well-being and the quality of time spent with children. So again, it's not a solution to the endogeneity problem, but perhaps a different type of modeling approach, structural equation or something like this may allow us to get at some of the household nature of the distribution of indirect care time, and then what we actually gain from having these appliances available and services available, or whose time exactly is being saved. And I'll leave it at that then.
Thank you, Maya. Actually, you give us idea about new research for Dr. Raghi, not for me now. I'm really thinking, if I save some time, then what shall I do with this time? Will it be my time after that? Will it be for my welfare, or will I give it to the children again? Perhaps redistribution again for the children or for the family. So it's very interesting to know what shall I do if I have home. I mean, if I save some of the unpaid work that I do, the time I spend in unpaid work, and also the distribution of work. If you have this technology, new technologies in appliances, what will the distribution of unpaid work between men and women will look like? So very nice ideas for new research work. The third paper is on the impact of early childhood care and education on maternal time use in Egypt. And this is by Caroline Kraft and Wutong Lee. And we all also know Caroline. She's an associate professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And she received her master's degree in public policy from also Humphrey School. And her research examines issues in development economics, primary labor, education, health, and inequality in the Middle East. Currently, she's working on green jobs, conflict, and displacement. So, Caroline, now I would like to see this work for you. And as usual, gender and labor markets. So it's time to listen to this paper also.
All right, good morning from Minnesota, everyone.
Hi.
The sun has now risen here. Let me share my screen. This will cooperate. So happy to be here in this panel on unpaid care work, and I'm going to be speaking about some work with a PhD student here at the University of Minnesota, Wutong Lee, that we looked at the impact of early childhood care and education on maternal time use in Egypt, so very much complementing the preceding two papers. So the motivation, I think, from this session, we are all very familiar with. We've seen this disparity in women's time relative to men's time spent in unpaid care work. And we also know from the earlier sessions that relatively few women, only 15% of women are employed versus 69% of men. So as Dr. Maya was alluding to, there's a lot of discussion about redistributing care responsibilities to the market through care services, and that this can at least in theory, potentially reduce gender disparities in time use and promote women's employment. So we have this dual goal. And early childhood care and education, ECCE, which covers per the UNICEF definition, ages 0 to 8, is one such service that we'll be talking about today. And we know from the global literature, there are many studies in a variety of country contexts around the world that generally ECCE improves maternal labor market outcomes. So women are more likely to be employed if they have access to ECCE, and they spend less time in unpaid care work when they have ECCE. So very important achieving those dual goals in the global literature. What we are doing in this paper is testing the potential of ECCE to decrease women's care work and increase their employment in the context of Egypt using the ELMPS 2023 data and this 24-hour time diary that we've all been enjoying so much in this session. So the approach we use is we do have a causal identification strategy called a regression discontinuity design approach. And the basic intuition for this is that there are cutoffs that we can use. And in this case, we use the cutoff for starting primary school and can look at those women with children just below the cutoff versus just above the cutoff to see the impact, the causal impact under certain assumptions, but the causal impact of having their children in this care context, in this educational care context, on then the mother's outcomes. And we looked earlier versions of the paper, we looked at pre-primary as well, but there was no jump at the cutoff, so we couldn't identify the impact there. So we're focusing on this entry into primary school. I will summarize the findings here and then go through them in some detail. But we find that ECCE does not reduce time spent in unpaid care work. It does not increase mothers' employment rates. So it does not have the expected effects here. The only thing that seems to be going on is a little bit of shifting about the exact timing and types of care work throughout the day. So I'll walk you through all those results. So in terms of what exactly we're measuring, the outcomes we're looking at, so we're very familiar now with this time use module in the 24-hour time diary, which has both primary and secondary activities in 15-minute increments. So we have quite detailed data. And the outcomes we're looking at are this direct caregiving, primary or secondary direct caregiving, and then the indirect caregiving, primary or secondary. And in some of our analyses, we'll break this down into specific types of indirect caregiving. As we saw, there's cleaning and food preparation and shopping and other types. We also have just a total, when we add these sort of together, total any time spent in caregiving, primary or secondary, direct or indirect. We have time spent in employment from the time use history, which we use just to be matching from the same data. And then we have the employment from the individual employment detection question, which is just a binary variable rather than time use. So those are our outcomes. Our key covariate is this early childhood care and education. And we're really looking at the transition into primary school as a form of care. So this is asked a little differently depending on the time, the age of the child at the fielding of the survey. So children who are under age 6 at the timing of the survey, we have a question in the household roster on the nursery use, childcare, or kindergarten use. And then children 6+, we're asked the individual questionnaire, and we have the education, whether they've ever been to school, and the level, including both primary and pre-primary, we can distinguish those. So we define ECCE as pre-primary, kindergarten, or primary, because of course the jump is only going to matter if you're actually changing care. If you're in pre-primary and then you go to primary, it won't necessarily have an impact on maternal time use. So we're looking at that change. So we're very familiar with versions of this figure on the gender division of labor, looking at how men at most are doing a very small amount per day of direct care, 0.2 hours, maybe 1 hour a day of indirect care, regardless of whether or what age children are. Women, we know, spend far more time in care. And the thing I'll highlight here that's different from the preceding versions you've seen of this figure is I'm looking very much at the age of the youngest child in a lot of detail. And direct care decreases as children age, right? When you go from 0 to 1, you have 3 hours per day, then you're dropping down to more like 2 by 4 to 5, and then 6 to 11, 1.4. So that's what we're looking at, is perhaps as they enter school, some of the direct care responsibilities may go down. We're not seeing much difference in indirect care, around 5 hours a day when children are present. So this is just sort of what we were expecting, is maybe there's going to be some pattern in care related to children starting school. So the method I explained a little bit already. I'll just go through a tiny bit of the technical details and won't subject you to too much of that. So we're using this cutoff I said, and it's called a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. So the cutoff for enrollment in Egypt is based on the child's age on September 30th. So you have to be age 6 by September 30th to begin primary school. And so we focus on a group that's right around this cutoff. We call them the age 6 group, but it's 6 months above and below the cutoff on September 30th of 2023. So it's their age on that date. So we adjust the ages relative to fielding. It's not necessarily their age at the time of fielding. And the ELMPS 2023 has birth month and year to facilitate being able to tell what age cutoff spot folks would fall into. So we have what's called an assignment variable. You'll see this in a lot of the graphs. It's the years relative to being age 6 on September 30th. So it goes from -0.5 to more than 0.5. Those with positive numbers were eligible. And based on the women's birth history and the mother line number in the household, we can map children's characteristics onto mothers' outcomes. So we match up children with their mothers. The cutoff is not mandatory. It's a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. It doesn't just go from 0% to 100% in ECC, a little less than that. And we use this regression discontinuity design estimator, which is the ratio in the jump in the outcome to the jump in the probability of treatment around the cutoff. It's parallel to two-stage least squares, if you're familiar with that. And we select our polynomial functional form. Turns out to be an intercept, but among intercept linear and quadratic options based on the one with the smallest likelihood based on the AIC, the Kiki information criteria. So I'll turn now to results, having subjected you to one slide of methods. This is looking at the jump in ECC around the cutoff. So this is basically asking, do we have an identification strategy? Can we actually, at least in the first stage, see this kind of jump we'd expect? And the answer is yes. So you're looking here along the years older than the September 30th cutoff. 0 is someone who is 6 right at September 30th. We're seeing that the proportion in early childhood care and education is much lower below the cutoff. And then you have near universal, these are the kids who've entered primary, more than 90% above the cutoff. So we have this good first stage. We have a plausible identification strategy. But what we see when we turn to the outcomes is, and I'll present them graphically, but the tables are really the same. I'll show one table in a minute, but the graphs, I think, tell you the story best. There's no impact on ECC eligibility. We're looking here on maternal time use. So these are the maternal time use outcomes, the average hours per day by the child's age in years from September 30th for mothers with a child by that cutoff. And you see the direct care hours are essentially the same. The points here are the averages for children in that age month. The band is the confidence interval, and the line is the intercept estimate. And so you see no difference given the confidence intervals. In terms of direct care hours, no difference in indirect care hours, no difference in any care hours, and no difference in employment hours. So no impact of ECCE on maternal time use. And also, likewise, the same kind of graph, just for employment as a binary variable, no impact of early childhood care and education eligibility on the maternal employment rate. No change when children become eligible. And so we use, of course, the full fuzzy regression discontinuity design models. And here we're presenting the first line is the jump in probability of being in ECC right around the cutoff. So we see that like 50 percentage point increase. So that first stage is always statistically significant, very well powered. But then when we look at the impact, which is the top line ECCE, we're seeing only very small, all statistically insignificant impacts of early childhood care and education on these care outcomes, these employment hours, and being employed. So the treatment estimates when we use this method are very similar to what I showed you in the graphs. None of these impacts is statistically significant. Early childhood care and education is not changing time use or employment outcomes for mothers. Now, when we dug into this, because it was a little surprising, we wanted to look at really what's happening within the day. So we did find some small differences in terms of things within the day. So this figure is showing over the course of 24 hours. So starting 0 is 1 minute after midnight, and we're going through a day. What's happening in terms of the proportion of women engaged in a primary activity of direct care, indirect care, any care, and employment. And this is based on the dotted line is children, women with children below the cutoff. The solid line is women with children above the cutoff. So the women above the cutoff, that solid line, their kids are eligible. They're likely in primary education. And so we do see a very slight increase, that first red arrow in the morning in direct care. So this could be, for example, getting your kids ready for school and taking them to school. Very slight increase in direct care. We then see that green arrow, a decrease in direct care during the peak of the school day, right? So during that sort of central few hours of the school day, we see a decrease in direct care. But then we see an increase in care later in the day. This might be picking up the kids, helping them with schoolwork. So those other red arrows are the increases later in the day in direct care work. And then we see the indirect care during those hours when children are at school. Indirect care actually goes up for the women with eligible children. So we interpret this as all this sort of additional care work related to early childhood care and education, because women disproportionately do that. And the indirect care also fills in the time when direct care decreased. Employment also for those women with children above the cutoff is more concentrated within school hours. So they may be doing what work they do in terms of employment within those school hour constrictions. So there's some small shifts in time of day in these descriptives. And we did a whole bunch of sensitivity and heterogeneity analysis to make sure our results were robust, and then to try to check what I just showed in that preceding graph. So most of them, all the sensitivity analyses show no difference from the main result in terms of no impact of ECCE when we use reduced form models, when we use half the bandwidth, when we use linear and quadratic models, when we use a two-stage least square model, or when we include control variables. There also aren't any differences between school and non-school hours, where school hours are 8 a.m. to 12:15 based on the child time use data on weekdays. And then the non-school hours are outside of this window, both weekdays and weekends. No impact on primary versus secondary activities, and no impact focusing solely on when the age group child is, age group 6 child is her youngest child. So these are all still the same main results of no impact. The two spots where we see some small differences relate to timing and type of care. So when we just focus on weekdays versus weekends, there's a significant reduction in indirect care hours on weekdays, and an insignificant increase in direct care hours on weekdays, indirect care hours on weekends. So it's a little bit of this shift in like what type you're doing when. And in terms of different types of indirect care activities, ECC leads to a significant reduction in time spent on food cooking specifically, which is likely to be perhaps cooking one less sort of lunchtime meal for the kids or something like that. But those are the only statistically significant impacts of ECCE. All the other analyses show no impacts, and these ones that we do see are very small. So to conclude, our expectation was, our hope was that services such as ECC would reduce the time women spend in unpaid care work. This is the redistribution to the market, and then increase their employment. And this is true in many other contexts. We see globally that this does tend to be the case. So for example, ECC in Mexico reduced mothers' time in childcare by 1.7 hours per day, increased employment rates by 18 percentage points, increased hours per week of employment by 7 hours. There was some clear substitution happening in that context. But our evidence suggests that in Egypt, ECCE, children starting primary, does not decrease time spent in unpaid care work, nor does it raise employment rates or hours. So this impact is not happening in Egypt. And I want to speculate a little bit, and maybe in the discussion we can talk about like why does ECC not change maternal outcomes in Egypt? One possibility is sort of design. Specifically, primary school days are pretty short. And some other studies link short hours of care to null or negative effects, especially in low female employment contexts. So when you already have a low female employment rate, hours are very constrained, it may not be as effective. Also, as we've been talking about a lot, Gender norms may really constrain any redistribution, whether in the household or to the market. So we have these strong gender norms around male breadwinner, female homemaker, and that also plays into shifting any free time from reduced direct care, maybe into other care activities, maybe more direct care for other children or indirect care. And also, gender norms are such that primary school creates additional care work, and that care work is taken on by mothers, given the gender division of care. So this could be drop off, pick up, help with schoolwork. And women may still face binding constraints on time use and employment related to gender norms around the employment side, like reservation working conditions, or as we talked about, the availability of decent jobs for women. And I'll note this research is consistent with other research from Egypt showing that childcare subsidies and employment services did not improve mothers' employment outcomes in a recent experiment as well. So there's this challenge of why are these services not working in the context of Egypt, I think, to try to unpack in future research. So thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Some kind of cultural awareness. If we free some time, that we go and read, or we go to gym, or this is not our habit. If we free some time, you go and do something for your children again, anyhow, or for cooking also. So we need here to change the minds towards freeing some time for yourself, for the women themselves. So let us see what the man will say. Mr. Abdurrahman Negi. He is the lead of evaluation specialist at 3I and MENA, at the MENA, and he was the director of learning and strategy at the Sawiris Foundation for Social Development. And he led many efforts in learning, evaluations, capacity building, research policy, and innovation. So with 20 years of experience in the social development sector, he has collaborated with many international organizations and Egyptian donors to design and assess the impact of development programs. And we are waiting for your comments now.
Oh, can you hear me well? Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hiba, for this introduction, and thank you so much, ARF, for inviting me to comment on my co-author, Dr. Caroline Kraft paper, which is super, super interesting and very relevant to my research. So just first of all, I would like to highlight the why. Why this kind of research is super important, right? And absolutely, I'm biased, given that I'm doing a lot of research on the same area. First, globally, women spend 3.2 hours for every hour spent of unpaid jobs for men, right? And the MENA region has basically the largest gap for unpaid work, unpaid care work, and employment as well. Egypt has the second lowest female force participation globally among countries without war or conflict. So the lowest one globally is Jordan with 14.6%. Egypt is the second lowest by 15.1%. Also, there's a huge decline in female force participation in Egypt. So it's actually decreased from 23% in 2018 to reach 15.1% in 2024, right? And according to a study that I like a lot that was conducted by OECD to measure the impact of COVID-19 in Egyptian household, they estimated that women are responsible for 90% of unpaid jobs within the household. And we hear today that basically women, that basically spending 80% of their time on unpaid jobs, right? And as you can imagine, a big portion of the time that women spend, they spend on raising their kids, right? But in addition to all of this is a very high policy priority that focus on increasing enrollment for early childhood development. And here they focus also for like Ministry of Social Solidarity, they focus on age between 0 to 5 years, in addition to the efforts from the Ministry of Education, right? However, the questions that it's important to think about, is it really about giving access to nurseries? Is this will solve the entire challenge that we're facing? And as we hear today from my colleague from the UN Women, that probably investing or like allocating almost 1%, if I remember well, from GDP per capita, on investing on ECCDs that basically could increase the entire GDP per capita on a national level. However, the question is how we can spend this money and in which area, and should we focus on giving access to ECCD, this will solve the entire problem, or there is something beyond this, right? Another thing that also we should think about, that really providing ECCD is super important for women. For my paper with Adam Osman and Brian Field, we found that basic women are willing to get less paid if the employer or firms are able to provide them social insurance, medical insurance, as well as ECCD. Right. From an academic perspective, this area is also super important. As my dear colleague, Caroline Kraft, she mentioned that there is a lot of academic papers and evidence that highlighted that providing ECCD services is actually positively impacting women's ability to join the labor force and increase female labor force participation, and also reduce number of hours that women spend of unpaid jobs, right? However, we don't have enough evidence relevant or like similar to this in the MENA region, right? And a recent experimental study that I'm very thankful and grateful that we conducted with Bruno Knipon, Stefano Caria, and Caroline Kraft, we found that very low or limited impact for providing free access to nurseries on female force participation. So with providing a free access for nurseries for entire year, this actually increased or like basically provided only 10.5% increase in applying for jobs, right? So even combining free access to nurseries plus job placement, only that like increase women interest to apply for jobs by 10.5%. Okay. There are many key findings that I like it a lot, but probably I can highlight a couple of points. The first one is ECCE does not significantly decrease mothers' overall time spent of unpaid care work, right? And it does not also increase women's ability to join the labor force. This is actually not a surprise. I just mentioned that for our experimental studies that we conduct in Cairo, we found very similar results, like providing this kind of services alone probably is good, but not sufficient, right? I also thought about like, there are 4 main takeaways out of this paper, right? The first one is social norms really matters. And it seems like social norms could impact a lot how mothers, or like mothers' ability to, how they spend their time and their ability to send their kids to nurseries or not, right? And we saw this very similar result to this in our study in Cairo, that basically only 1/3 of the fathers, they think that women are allowed or okay to send their kids to nurseries, and 2/3 of mothers, they think so, right? So I'm not surprised that only 1/3 of the fathers, they think that women can send or should send their kids to nurseries, but I'm really surprised that like only 2/3 of women think about the same. There's also another very key takeaway here, which the nursery working hours, right? Nursery working hours is a super important element, right? Because the nursery work day is very short. So even if you are sending your kids to a nursery, does not mean that women will be able to go to work. Most of the nurses, they work for like 4 to 6 hours, but like we know that basically to join the labor force, they might need to work for like 8 hours and add the commuting time. So probably you need to have a nurse that's basically take care of your kids for a very longer time during the day. There's also a lot of hidden costs, right? So it's not only about going or sending your kids to nurseries, but also sending your kids to nurseries, it means there's another cost related to like getting, like preparing snack boxes or like food for your kids to go to nurseries, or giving them money to basically buy anything they might need during the day, or also buying clothes for them. And all of this could actually represent a very huge cost that would make fathers and mothers think a lot about if they are able to send their kids to nurseries or not, right? Another element that I liked it a lot, that basically, although that even sending your kids to nursery could be positive from one side, but from another side, you can think about this could also increase the time you spend on studying for your kids, or preparing them to go to schools, or even picking them up from the nurseries. There's also another super important element that we usually do not think about when we think about giving access to nurses could be sufficient in increasing female force participation. A few elements here that I think is important to think about as part of our analysis for this paper. The first one is actually this automatic enrollment system or policy in Egypt, right? So when you look into like the enrollment rate in Egypt, it's something between 98.5% and it reached 100% some years, right? So super important element here that enrollment does not mean that really parents are sending their kids to schools, right? So they might be enrolled, but they are not going to school. So it means they are staying with their mothers in house, which means it's really here enrolling in schools is not really helping mothers. That's number one. Another thing is actually important that although the policy that is stating that kids should be enrolled automatically at the age of 4, but in practice it's completely different. We see that basically kids, they only join or start their joining the preschool at 5 or sometimes at 6. It depends on the availability of spots within the schools, right? So here there's also another aspect that you should think about, which is about the gap between the policy and the practice. Super important element here is more about the official records of like enrollment. When basically think about enrollment, you mentioned in your paper that the cutoff was in September 30, right? However, officially, the official records from the Ministry of Education, they actually they take it at November 3rd, right? So it's completely different. So number of enrolled students fluctuating a lot before November 3rd. So think about the cutoff at September 3rd. It's quite risky and probably could be better and more accurate if we shift it to basically focus on November 3rd. There are a few elements that would be super important if we can think about them for future field work. One you already mentioned, which more about social perception, right, and social norms. And I can add here the possible pluralistic ignorance, right? So there might be this pluralistic ignorance about how mothers think about other mothers would see them if they decided to send their kids to nurseries, right? And if there is here a pluralistic ignorance, probably this will be a great opportunity for just correcting their beliefs and see the impact of correcting their beliefs to really increase not only the enrollment to ECCD, but also attending the ECCD. Another element, which great that we are testing this as part of our second nurseries project, is the role of mother-in-law, right? And basically, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence by conducting focus groups and depth interviews. We see a lot of mothers, they keep mentioning that even if their partners, they would like to help them or like they encourage them to their kids to nurses, but they might be worried from their mothers-in-law and how this will be received from their sides, right? So even working on their mothers-in-law, correcting their beliefs, this probably will have a huge impact on decisions that would support women to reduce the time they spent on unpaid jobs or even joining the labor force, right? Super important elements here is not looking into access. I think access is important, but it's not the only element, right? So we saw in many cases that kids are enrolled in certain schools as ECCD, but this school actually is located far from their houses. They are not really able to go to this place on a daily basis, right? So we need also to get more data about the location as well as the working hours and if there is any other hidden costs associated with sending your kids to ECCD. Again, I love this paper. It's super important. We need more and more papers that focus on the impact of ECCD on female force participation. However, we need to think carefully about is really giving only access to ECCD is sufficient? And if we are planning, and I actually encourage and I advocate for investing more and more in giving access to ECCD, but we need to think about not only give access to ECCD, but probably beyond this, working on social norms and other aspects could negatively impact mothers' ability to send their kids to nurseries. Thank you so much, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to, after the questions here, I want to know the role of the mothers-in-law because I didn't get it in this context. So, because of time, we want to take around 2 questions. Shireen, how many questions? See the floor. Okay. So we start with you, Maya.
Thank you to all the presenters actually for the very nice and rich papers. I have one question to Dr. Raghi, and It's about what Maya said about the household composition and whether there are other women in the household or not. I believe if there is a way to find out, I don't believe if you can look at the relation to the head of household, there is difference whether there is another woman in the household and the relationship to this, of this woman to the head of the household. For instance, if she's a daughter, she might help in the mother in reducing the number of hours spent in domestic work, while if she's the mother-in-law, the impact might be just the opposite. So it's very important actually to include this, and I hope, inshallah, in the 6th round, that there will be a way to include whether the household is an apartment within an extended family building, or whether it's an isolated apartment. Thank you.
And whether the mother-in-law is there or no.
Oh, yes.
Okay, I sense there are increasing in discussion about the fatwa of Sheikh Al-Azhar حق الكد والسعاية. حق الكد والسعاية. It's unpaid care work. It's similar to that. So I was that the woman has the right to be paid for her care work. It's fatwa called حق الكد والسعاية. So since we are discussing, or there is a discussion about this issue, so can we make a correlation between the household wealth index and the unpaid care work from males and females? In addition, can we measure the cost of unpaid care work? Thank you.
To measure the cost of unpaid. Okay. If you hire somebody, then you can measure the cost of your unpaid work.
So we can get this data from the ELMPS, right?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
First presenters. In one of your graphs, you showed that for married women, the amount of unpaid care work is actually higher if they are unemployed than if they are inactive. I found that extremely interesting. Was there any explanation in the paper regarding that? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hiba. I have a question for Caroline's paper. I'm sorry, I didn't fully catch the part when you were talking about the sensitivity analysis and the heterogeneity, but I was wondering if you had done this analysis for different groups. So for example, the first guess that came into my mind why we don't see a difference is probably a woman that has a kid going into prep school or primary school. Probably by the time he's going to primary school, she has a second kid lined up. So there's no change that happens in her and how she spends the time because she's taking care of the new kid. So I was wondering if you had looked at, for example, women that only have one child and women who have previously worked and then had a kid and maybe an only kid. Is there any difference in their behavior? And maybe the last thing, is there a difference by socio-economic status? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's a new paper. And then, yes.
After
you and then Dr. Mona.
Okay, thank you. Just thanks for the 3 interesting papers. Just a quick question to Ragi's paper. Since you, anyway, like with the controls, you didn't do the best in terms of accounting for the potential indigeneity you're worried about. Have you thought also of like as a robustness check, just to exploit the panel structure and just, for example, focus on the family structure or the women who were already married through maybe since the last panel and see, it's just like maybe we can assume, it's not the best again assumption, but we can assume that the indigeneity that you're worried about is time invariant and see as a robustness check, this will also help instead of the controls. Have you thought of that?
Okay, Mona.
to a specific paper, but in general, you know, I can't remember if it was the first or the second paper that we saw. It's about the gender division of care work, how it, the figure I think was 6-1. And I think there was one of the commentators from ILO, she pointed that it was actually 90% or 9-1. I was wondering what would be a good comparator group. Is it middle income countries? Is it MENA countries? And in case we have like a particular ratio that is seen to be equivalent to international, to, you know, I'm sure it will not be 50-50, but I mean, if there is a certain figure, and if we can use that as a threshold to study the characteristics of men in those households that are approaching that, you know, to know what sort of demographic and other characteristics are associated with with the conversions to international comparisons. I think that would be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. The last one, last question.
Hello, and thank you so much. This is May Ahmed from UN Women. A little bit of a question, but a general comment also on to reflect, I think, on the last paper and on your final comments on the difference between the need to study the difference between the policy and the practice. Because I saw that in the first paper, for example, one of the recommendations, which of course are very much encouraged, was to also have a change in policy, including on paternity leave and what have you. But we know from pre-existing policies, for example, already in the labor law, the fact that any institution that has more than 100 women must have a child care facility, but we know that, for example, in practice, this is a deterrent for employers to actually employ more women with children. So this is just food for thought, because linking this to that, and also noting this as one of the potential solutions is a very interesting item to reflect upon, and the impact on the difference between policy and practice in real life. Thank you.
And practice. So I'll give now the floor to the speakers to answer, and if the discussants want to say also anything. Where are the speakers?
Okay, I just wanted to answer the question on for never married women. We also found that it was interesting that unemployed women who were never married spent more time on unpaid care work compared to inactive women. So we haven't really explored a potential explanation for this, but what I'm thinking is maybe unemployed women who were never married are older, and the inactive women are younger, so maybe it has to do with age. So maybe we can check the mean age of these two groups. And yeah, so maybe because they are older, and so their family, even if they're still not married, their family is expecting more involvement in unpaid care activities from them. But yeah, it would be good to empirically check. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to thank Maya for her excellent comments. And I think the point she made about the fact that the people do multitasking, and it's hard to identify time spent cooking versus time spent cleaning versus time in other care work is very well taken. And that's why we see some kind of leakage of effects, where something is expected to only affect cleaning, but it also affects other things. And that's probably because of the multitasking that women do. I think that's a great point. I also like the suggestions on the other aspects of the multivariate models, especially looking at total hours per household. Now, on this issue of presence of other women in the household, so we actually have a control in the model for whether the mother-in-law is present, and it has no effect. And But we also have controls for both women and men in the age range 18 to 24, 25 to 59, 60 to 74, and 76 plus. And in almost all the age ranges when women are present, that reduces the indirect unpaid care work, except for the 76 plus, which has no effect. When men are present, it has the opposite effect. So young men in particular, 18 to 24, increases the time in unpaid care work. So I think that, but your point about whether the mother-in-law is close in another house dwelling connected or not is one that we could look at maybe in the next round. But on Rania's, I wish the panel data could help us. But first, we don't have time use data in the 2018 data set. So it's impossible to do panel changes in the panel. Maybe by 2030, when we do it again, we will have panel data on the time use and can do that. But also there are other problems. Most appliances are acquired at marriage. I suspect very few households acquire additional appliances after marriage. And so the change is going to be looking at people who are already married and looking at change in appliance ownership may not work that well. And also housing, which determines the access to services, is also done at marriage most of the time. And so again, I doubt that there's going to be enough time varying effects to look at what you're suggesting. But it's a good idea, but unfortunately, I don't think it's feasible.
All right, I'll add in here. Thank you, everyone, for the excellent comments and particularly appreciate Abdurrahman's discussion. A few points there. I do want to highlight, I think as some of the other presentations noted, I was looking at maternal outcomes. Of course, there could be early childhood development impacts of these types of services that are not what I'm looking at. So wanted to note that's particularly important. And I think it's a really key takeaway that services alone might be good, but not sufficient to change care work and employment patterns, and that social norms matter. I do think one really great thing in the first presentation was, though, noting that even in households where gender norms are supportive of the husbands having a role, it doesn't appear to have translated into behavior yet. So first you may need norms change, but then you need the behavior component of norms change as well. And it's a very good point that all of these additional services, potentially like childcare, have additional hidden costs and time costs. A couple of folks spoke to the point about enrollment versus attending and sort of policy versus practice. And that's something we can look at actually empirically in terms of children's attendance. So we'll definitely check that. But I do think it's a very important point that some of the existing policies potentially make disincentives for women's employment as well. On Rasha's question, the right to be paid for unpaid care work, we do have measures of how much you'd have to pay for unpaid care services if you bought them in the market. So you can estimate that. It's challenging to estimate accurately, but that is possible. In terms of the sensitivity and heterogeneity analyses, so yes, sorry, we went through a bunch of them very quickly. So we did look, though, at what you were asking about there. We looked at only the mothers for whom the age 6 child, so right above or below the cutoff, 5.5 to 6.5, was the youngest. So they would not have another younger child. They might have additional older children. And there was still no impact for that specific group. We didn't look at those with only one child because that's a quite small group. And we didn't look at those who worked before because, again, that's a quite small group. We can look more, though, by socioeconomic status. So we might do that in future work. And then just one thing to highlight, I think that Mona Sayed was alluding to is in terms of the gender division of labor in the household. An interesting area for future work could be looking at positive deviance. So who are the men who are actually doing care work? Are there very many? It might be hard to analyze them, but if there's a group of men who are doing more care work, who are they sort of this group engaged in norms change and trying to learn from them what might be lessons for policy and practice going forward. So greatly appreciate all these excellent contributions and discussion. Thank you.
Discussants have something to say at the end? Do you have, if you want to add?
One point on the calculation of unpaid care work, there are a lot of modeling that ILO and UN Women and others have done, so you can actually know the cost, like the estimate of how much is the unpaid care work, cost in a household.
Yeah, one actually point for Ragi's paper was the first paper actually. It would be amazing if we can actually estimate the impact of providing this appliance on productivity, income, and well-being as well. Like there is this very famous paper for Sandoval where basically they measure the impact of quality of sleep on productivity as well as the well-being. And something that will be super interesting if we can estimate the impact out of this if possible, or even for further research projects.
It was really a nice session, actually, and so many good ideas were there and discussed. But finally, I want to complicate somehow the issue. What about hybrid work, work from home, sitting at home, attending meetings, and doing unpaid work together? You know, we are all multitask. All women are doing this. When they sit at home and they have work at home, and they are doing the unpaid work in addition to the meetings that they are hearing or attending, and somehow also commenting. And I know many women like that, me also. So can you calculate now the unpaid work and the paid work? And I mean, can you do something like?
Well, we know whether women are working from home. And so we have that data, but there's this potential interdependence between the two variables. Maybe you're working from home because you have a lot of unpaid care work. And so, and
with Shireen at home, and she's doing something else, and I'm doing something else. So
yeah, well, what I cannot measure, what we cannot measure is the effect of that on your productivity.
I didn't ask about productivity. We are productive. So, think about, I mean, if you ask most of the women after COVID now, and since we are now used to homework, somehow, I'm sure they are doing shopping sometimes. I know people who are in the cars and attending meetings and going to shop. So now the calculation will be a little bit complicated. So now, actually, we finished with this session, and I want to thank all the speakers and discussants and also attendees. It was a very fruitful session. Thank you.